Welcome to Revolution Chronicles, where we bring forgotten pieces of American history back to life. If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss the past, whispering into the present now. Let us step back to the summer of 1898 in Central Park, where children played under the sun and a strange secret waited quietly in the shadows. In the summer of 1898, New York City was alive with noise and movement, the kind of restless energy that seemed to grow with every year as the city stretched higher with new buildings and wider with new streets. The trolley bells rang out. Through the avenues, horse-drawn carriages rolled endlessly over cobblestones, and the sounds of hammers and saws echoed as new construction rose everywhere. But in the middle of all that chaos, in the center of the city, stood something very different. A place of green and stillness. A place where the heart could breathe. Central Park, for many New Yorkers, Central Park was not simply a park, it was an escape. It had been designed decades earlier with the idea that city people deserved more than brick and smoke and noise. It was a landscape built with care, rolling meadows, quiet paths, shaded trees, and sparkling ponds. Every year, thousands came to walk there, to sit there, to rest their tired bodies and their tired minds. It was a place where the city's poor and rich alike could wander together, though often apart, and pretend for a few hours that the harsh world outside did not exist. That summer of 1898 was a hot one. The kind of summer where the air hung thick and heavy, where the tenements baked like ovens, where the streets gave off the smell of dust, manure, and sweat. Families who had no way to leave the city would take their children into Central Park in hopes of catching a breeze beneath the trees. The children came running and shouting, their laughter carrying across the lawns. They played games of tag. They kicked balls made of rags. They climbed low branches and splashed their feet at the edges of the ponds. It was childhood as it should be, full of sound and movement, unbothered by the world outside. Photographer, whose name has long since been forgotten, was walking through the park that summer. He was one of many who had taken to carrying the newer handheld cameras, which made it easier to capture moments of ordinary life. Not just stiff studio portraits, he had an eye for scenes that told a story. And when he came upon a group of children playing near the edge of a shaded path, he lifted his camera and took a picture. It was nothing unusual, just a moment frozen in time. Children in the light trees arching overhead, the faint outline of the city in the distance. Photograph was developed later that week, and like so many images of the era, it was printed on stiff card and placed in a box along with others. It might have been passed around a family's parlor, shown to neighbors, pinned to a wall. It was the kind of image that brought a smile, for it showed what everyone wanted to see: innocence, life, energy, in the face of a city that could so often feel grim. But there was something about this picture that even then made a few people pause. Something in the far corner of the image, almost hidden in the darker tones. At first, no one thought much of it. Photographs were not perfect, after all. Cameras caught shadows in strange ways. Sometimes a smudge on the lens or a trick of light could make an object seem to appear where it did not belong. But when you looked closer at this photograph, the feeling that something was not quite right began to grow. The children were sharp in their detail. You could see the curls of hair, the shine of shoes, the folds of worn clothing. But in the shaded corner stood a figure, or perhaps not a figure exactly, more like the faint shape of one. It looked like someone standing very still, watching. The strange part was not just that it looked like a person, but that it looked like a child who did not seem to belong with the others. This child was not running, not smiling, not even moving. Instead, it stood near the tree, its face hard to see, its body almost blending into the shadows. It was the kind of thing you might miss if you were not looking for it, but once you saw it, you could not unsee it. Word of the photograph spread quietly at first among those who had seen it. Neighbors whispered that it was unusual, that it gave them chills. Some said it was nothing but a play of light on the trees. Others said it looked too real to be dismissed. There were people in those years who believed that cameras sometimes captured more than the human eye could see, that a lens could trap not only the image of the living, but also the presence of something else, something from another side too. Understand why people might think this way? You must remember what the year 1898 was like. America was a country between eras. The Civil War was still within living memory, and thousands of families had lost loved ones in battles that left no proper graves. Death was no stranger to anyone. Children died young from fevers and infections that today would be cured in hours. Epidemics swept through crowded neighborhoods, leaving behind empty cribs and silent playrooms. Grief was everywhere, and people searched desperately for ways to hold on to the ones they lost. Spiritualism, the belief that the dead could communicate with the living, had gained a stronghold in America since the mid-1800s. Families sat with mediums in darkened rooms, listening for raps on tables or faint voices. Calling out their names, and photographs were sometimes believed to be another tool of contact. People told stories of ghostly faces appearing beside widows or lost children showing up faintly on family portraits. So, when some looked at that 1898 Central Park photograph and saw not only children at play, but one more child, one who seemed apart, they could not help but feel a shiver. Could it be one of those strange photographic accidents? Or was it something else, a trace of a child who had once played there, but was no longer among the living? The park itself had its own history by then. The land where Central Park was built had once been home to small communities of working people, including a mostly black community known as Seneca Village. In the 1850s, that community had been torn down, its homes demolished to make way for the grand park that city leaders imagined. They said it was for the good of the people, for progress, for beauty. But the families who had lived there lost everything over time. Their memory faded, and few who strolled those winding paths in 1898 thought about what had been there before. Yet the ground remembered. Every path, every tree, every stone wall had once been touched by other hands, walked on by other feet. Some believed that such histories did not vanish so easily, and so the story began to grow around that single photograph. It became one of those local tales that pass quietly from mouth to mouth, that survive not in newspapers or books, but in whispered memory. Some said the strange figure was a trick of the light. Others swore it was the ghost of a child from Seneca Village watching the play of children who had taken its place in the park. Some even claimed that if you went to that part of the park at dusk, you might feel a chill or hear a faint sound like the laughter of children that faded as soon as you turned your head. But here is where the story becomes more curious. The photograph itself was said to have been stored in a family album in New York. For many years, the family descendants carried it with them when they moved, eventually leaving the city. But somewhere along the line, the picture vanished. Perhaps lost in a move, perhaps destroyed, perhaps simply forgotten. And yet fragments of the tale remained, not the photograph itself, but the memory of it, the words passed from one generation to the next. Imagine now for a moment the children of 1898 running across the park, their shoes kicking up dust, their shouts ringing out. They had no thought of the camera, no thought of shadows. Their world was only that moment, the bright day, the game at hand. Yet behind them, in the quiet shade, a presence seemed to linger, something outside their laughter, something that belonged to another time. And the camera, the unblinking witness, caught it without knowing. What was it? That the photograph showed a child who had been left out of play, a stranger passing through a trick of the eye. Or was it one of those mysteries that history sometimes leaves us with, a reminder that our world is layered with past lives and lost stories waiting to be remembered? This is where the story begins. The story of that photograph might have faded into nothing more than rumor, if not for the persistence of memory. Families in New York have always been good at remembering things, not in neat lines of fact, but in stories retold over supper, in rocking chairs on summer porches, in whispered warnings to children who ask too many questions. That is how pieces of history survive. Not always in books, not always in the halls of museums, but in the trembling voice of a grandmother saying, "Once I saw something that should not have been there." By the time the 20th century came roaring in with its streetcars and electric lights and the clamor of a new Modern age, the old photograph of Central Park had already begun to carry that kind of weight. People no longer spoke of it as a picture of children at play. They spoke of it as the picture with the shadow child. The words were simple, but the meaning heavy. It was not just that the figure seemed odd. It was that it seemed wrong in a way that it stirred unease deep in the chest. Central Park itself kept changing year after year. The paths were worn by thousands of feet, the meadows filled with baseball players and Sunday strollers, the carriages rolled past with fine ladies holding parasols, and immigrant mothers pushing baby carriages they had saved months to afford. But there were always corners of the park that felt different places, where the trees grew thick and light struggled to break through, where the air seemed heavy, where a person alone might feel watched, though no one was there. People told themselves it was only imagination. Every park has shadows. Every park has wind that sounds like voices when it moves through the branches. But when stories already exist in people's concerns, and AB soars already exist in people's minds, every shadow, every breeze feels like proof. What made the photograph so powerful was that it gave shape to those feelings. For decades, New Yorkers had heard bits of gossip about ghosts in Central Park. Some swore the lake was haunted by a drowned man who never made it back to shore. Others spoke of strange cries near the Ramble at night, or of figures seen slipping between trees then gone without a sound. The city was full of stories like that because the city was full of loss. Every street corner, every building had known death, accidents, fires, fevers, crimes. The park was no different. It simply carried its ghosts more quietly. Under leaves and grass in 1898, children were everywhere in the city, and they were not always safe. Their laughter was the brightest sound of New York, but it was fragile. Children darted between horse-drawn wagons in crowded streets. They worked in factories where machines chewed up tiny fingers. They slept in tenements where one spark could end 100 lives. In minutes a day, in Central Park was, for many of them, a rare taste of freedom, a place where they could run without fear, and for their parents, a moment's relief to see their sons and daughters alive and happy. And so perhaps that was what made the figure in the photograph so unsettling. To see children at play, but also to see one who did not belong, was to be reminded of how easily a child's laughter could vanish, how quickly an empty chair could appear at the family table. There was a certain man who became fascinated by the photograph in the early years of the new century. He was not a famous man, only a teacher, who lived near the park. He was known among his neighbors for keeping clippings of unusual stories and for writing down accounts of things others ignored. He came upon the photograph one evening when visiting friends who still kept it in their album. They laughed about it, called it their ghost picture, showed it off as a curiosity, but the teacher looked longer than the rest. He said nothing then, but later he asked to see it again. He studied the shadow child with the same intensity he gave to his students' lessons. As though the answer might be hidden in its blurred outline, he began to ask questions of old park workers, men who had been there since the 1860s and 70s. He asked if any child had died in the park, if there had been accidents, drownings, fevers. He learned stories, one after another. A little boy who had slipped into the lake chasing a ball, a girl who had wandered away from her nurse and been found later near the Ramble, her death never explained, a sickly child who had spent his last afternoons in the fresh air of the park only to die at home before the summer ended. These were not written down in city records, but told by word-of-mouth, fragments of truth and rumor. Blending together, the teacher filled notebooks with them, each name, each date, each whispered tragedy. The photograph in his mind was not only an image, but a key. He wondered whether the shadow child might be one of those lost children whose names barely reached the newspapers and whose graves were visited only once a year, if at all. He wrote long letters about it to a few acquaintances in the city who shared his curiosity. Some dismissed him. Others encouraged him, saying, "Yes, it is possible. Cameras catch things the eye cannot. Cameras are honest," they said. "They have no reason to lie." At honesty in a photograph is a strange thing. A picture may show exactly what stood before the lens, yet the mind may see more than what was there. The human heart fills in shadows with fears. With longing, with memory, that was the difficulty the teacher faced. He could not prove what the figure was, but he could not shake the feeling that it was real. Real in some way that mattered, even if no one else believed him. By 1910, the photograph had already begun to fade, not only in color, but in presence. The family who owned it moved away, and it was seen less and less. The teacher kept writing down his stories, though most of them were never published. He died quietly in the 1920s, and his notebooks disappeared with his belongings, yet a handful of his writings survived, passed among friends, and later collectors. They told of his search, of his questions, of his belief that Central Park itself carried the weight of forgotten children. In the years that followed, the world changed again. The city built higher, the park filled with automobiles, and later, radios carried voices across the lawns, but the whispers never left. Even in the 1930s and 40s, stories were told of children seen where none should be. A policeman walking the park at night claimed he heard laughter, but found no one. A woman in the Depression said she saw a girl in old-fashioned dress standing by a tree who vanished when approached. These were dismissed as tricks of the mind, the kind of tales lonely people tell in hard times, but they added to the legend, and through it all, the memory of the photograph lingered, though no one seemed to know where it had gone. It became like a missing puzzle piece, something spoken of, but never held. A memory that drew people's imaginations toward that summer day in 1898, when children's laughter rang through the air and the camera caught something that did not belong. Some swore it must have been a lost child of Seneca Village, one whose home was erased to make room for the park. Some said it was the spirit of a child lost in one of the countless accidents that city records never kept. Some even whispered that it was not a ghost at all, but something older, something tied to the land itself, before houses, before roads, before the city at all. Whatever it was, the photograph kept working its quiet power long after the print itself had vanished. People still remembered it, and memory in the end is its own kind of truth. As the decades passed and New York marched into modern times, the old stories clung stubbornly, like ivy to stone walls. They were not written in history books or mentioned in polite company, but they were there, waiting to be told, waiting to stir again. With each new generation walking those shaded paths, and whenever children's laughter rang out in the summer air, some could not help but wonder, was there another child there, still watching, still waiting, hidden in the corners of the park, unseen except by the unblinking eye of a camera long ago? By the middle of the 20th century, New York was a different city, yet in many ways it was the same. The skyline had risen higher, the streets had grown louder, the pace of life had quickened, but Central Park remained what it had always been, a place set apart, a green heart beating in the center of all that. Iron and stone. Soldiers had returned from wars, families had moved out to new suburbs, radios and televisions filled homes, yet people still came to the park as they had in 1898, to walk, to rest, to breathe, and as long as people came, the whispers never died. Strange photograph was no longer in sight by then. It had slipped away into the folds of private memory, but the story of it still lingered. There were those who remembered hearing about the shadow child from their parents or grandparents. They did not need to see the picture themselves to feel uneasy when they walked the paths at dusk, or when their own children laughed and played near the shaded trees. Some said the park carried an energy that could not be explained, not frightening exactly, but heavy, a kind of unseen weight. It was as if the joy of countless children who had run across the lawns was mingled with the sadness of those who had not lived long enough to run at Allen. The 1950s, a reporter for a small city paper stumbled across the story while doing research for an article on forgotten New York legends. He interviewed old residents who spoke of the photograph as though it were a family heirloom everyone knew about, yet no one could find. He tracked down descendants of the teacher who had once studied the picture, but they knew nothing of his notebooks, They remembered only that he had been a serious man who sometimes spoke of ghosts. The reporter never found the photograph, but his article revived the tale for a new generation. Readers wrote letters to the paper telling of their own experiences in the park. A child seen briefly, then gone, a sound of footsteps when no one was. Near a cold breeze on the warmest day of summer, the city was changing quickly. In those years, Central Park itself was going through hard times. Crime was rising. Parts of the park fell into neglect. Benches, broken grass, worn thin, graffiti scrawled on stone bridges, but even then, people came and the park remained a stage where lives unfolded. Lovers walked their children, learned to ride bicycles, musicians played on summer evenings, and always the sense lingered that the park carried its own secret memory. For some, that memory was tied to the photograph. For others, it was simply the feeling that no matter how many feet walked those paths, they were not the first, and they would not be the last. Story of the photograph might have slipped again into silence, if not for one curious event. In 1967, a man named Robert Wellen claimed to have found an old box of photographs in the attic of a brownstone his family had owned 4 generations. Among them, he said, was the very image of children playing in Central Park in 1898 with the shadow child in the corner. Wellen told friends about it, and word spread quickly. Some said they saw the photograph and swore it was real. Others said Wellen was exaggerating or inventing the story altogether. The photograph itself was never shown publicly, and when Wellen died only a few years later, the box of photographs vanished again, if it ever truly existed at all. But the whispers returned stronger than before. People spoke once more of the child in the shadows of the park, the ghost who appeared only when a lens was turned its way. By the 1970s and 80s, ghost stories had found a new audience in America. There was a hunger for the strange and the unexplained. People bought books of haunted places and tuned their televisions to programs about mysteries unsolved. Central Park had its share of mentions, usually short paragraphs about footsteps in the ramble or faint music by the lake. But always buried within those mentions was the quiet rumor of a photograph from 1898, one that showed children playing and one who should not have been there. Some said it was only legend, yet legends have a way of clinging because they touch something in the human heart. For in truth, the shadow child was not only a ghost story, it was also a reflection of loss, a reminder of how fragile children's lives once were, even in the 20th century as medicine improved and living standards rose. Childhood was never without danger. Cars replaced horses, but children were still struck down in the streets. Diseases were fought with vaccines, but new illnesses came in their place. Families continued to bury the young before their time, and so when people heard of a photograph that showed a child who was present yet apart, they recognized in it the shadow that always hovered over parenthood, the fear that joy could vanish in an instant. Older New Yorkers, especially those who had grown up in the tenements or who had lost brothers and sisters early, carried that understanding deep within them. They knew what it meant to see an empty place at the table, to hear a silence where laughter once had been. For them, the story of the photograph was not frightening, it was sorrowful. It spoke not of monsters or horrors, but of the quiet weight of grief and the way the past never quite lets go. Some even found comfort in it, believing that if the photograph truly showed a lost child, then it meant that the child was not entirely gone, that perhaps, in some way, the child was still there, still watching, still part of the world, even if only faintly in the corner of a picture. The belief might not have been logical, but it was deeply human. For what parent, what brother, what sister has not longed for a trace of someone they loved in the 1990s? Another surge of interest came when a historian working on the history of Seneca Village mentioned the Opopokaf. In a lecture, he did not claim it was real, but he used the story as a way of reminding his audience that the land beneath Central Park had once been filled with families, homes, gardens, and children's voices. He spoke of how the creation of the park had erased those lives, but not their memory, and he suggested that the legend of the Shadow child might in some way be tied to that erasure, a symbol of the children displaced and forgotten when their homes were torn down. His words struck listeners deeply, for they realized that behind every ghost story, there is often a truth not of the supernatural but of human suffering. That idea stayed with many. For even if the photograph was never found again, even if it had only been a trick of light, it had become more than a curiosity. It had become a symbol of memory itself, of the way the past lingers beneath the surface of the present. In the laughter of children in Central Park today, some imagine they hear echoes of those long gone in the shade of the trees. They sense the presence of lives once lived there long before. Paths were paved and statues raised, and the story endures, still carried forward not by the photograph itself, but by the weight of memory. When children laugh in the park, their joy is as bright as it was in 1898, but behind that joy there is always the shadow of loss, the reminder that every life is precious and fleeting. That is why the tale of the shadow child still matters, because it reminds us not only of what might be unseen in the corners of photographs, but also of what is unseen in history, the countless children who lived, who laughed, who were loved, and who vanished too soon, leaving behind only faint traces, whispers, and sometimes a shadow in the corner of a summer day. Today, if you walk through Central Park on a bright afternoon, you will see what people have always seen. Children laughing, children chasing balls, children tugging at their mother's hands and running ahead. With the impatience of youth, the air will be filled with voices, the rustle of leaves, the distant rumble of the city just beyond the trees. And yet, if you stop for a moment, if you stand very still and look carefully into the shaded corners, you may feel something that cannot be named. It's not a sound, not a shape, not anything you can point to exactly, but a weight, a presence like the faint echo of a memory. The story of the 1898 photograph. It's been told and retold so many times that no one can say where the truth begins or ends. Perhaps the photograph was real. Perhaps it was never more than rumor. Perhaps the shadow in the corner was a trick of light, or perhaps it was something else, something that does not easily fade. But what matters more than the photograph itself is the way it has lived in memory, for memory is the real ghost of history. It lingers long after photographs fade and papers crumble. It walks beside us in the places where our ancestors once stood. When you think about it, Central Park has always been a place of ghosts. The ground itself holds them. The stones and soil were once the foundation of homes, gardens, schools, and churches belonging to Seneca village families who built their lives there before the park swept them away. Their voices once rang in laughter and song and prayer and argument in the simple daily noise of living. Though their houses are gone, the ground remembers. Every tree that stands now has roots that reach deep into that history. Every path winds over lives that once were. It is no wonder that people sometimes feel watched in the park, for they are walking where others once walked, where children once played, and where families once dreamed. The shadow child of the photograph is part of that larger truth, for whether it was real or imagined, whether it was one lost boy, one forgotten girl, or only a smear of darkness it came to symbolize. All the children whose lives touched the park and were left behind, children who died of fever before doctors could help them, children who drowned in ponds while nurses looked away, children who worked themselves to exhaustion in factories and never had the chance to run through the meadows again. The shadow child is not one child, it is many. It is the echo of a whole generation of voices carried away too soon, and perhaps that is why the story still moves people even now, more than a century later. Because everyone knows the ache of absence. Everyone has felt the silence of a place where laughter used to be. Everyone has looked at an old photograph and felt tears rise at the sight of a face that no longer looks back. That is the power of the story, not in fear, but in longing, in the way it touches that most human of truths, that life is fragile and memory is pre-stale. And memory is the only way we keep it from vanishing. the 2000s historians began again to speak more about Seneca Village and the lives erased to build. Central Park archaeologists dug in the ground, uncovering fragments of dishes, shoes, tools, pieces of families who had lived there a century before. And as the city began to acknowledge those lives, the story of the photograph gained new meaning. Perhaps the Shadow Child was not only a ghost story, but also a symbol of all the children of Seneca Village whose laughter once filled that land. Their names were forgotten, their houses lost, but in some way the legend of the Shadow Child kept their memory alive, reminding visitors that the park was not born from empty land, but from sacrifice and displacement. Walk the paths today, and you may see tourists, smiling families, gathering children, racing ahead with kites. But if you know the story, if you carry it in your mind, you may also see beyond the present. You may see the children of 1898 running in there, knickers and dresses with rag balls in hand. You may see the children of Seneca Village running between gardens and church steps before the city forced them away. You may see the children lost to illness and accident whose families brought them here for a final breath of clean air. You may see all of them together in one long, unbroken line, the past flowing into the present. The photograph itself may never be found. Perhaps it sits forgotten in a box in some attic, yellowed and brittle. Perhaps it was burned in a move or lost in a flood. Perhaps it never existed at all in the way we imagine, but that hardly matters now. For the photograph has done its work. It has become part of the fabric of memory. It has forced people to look closer to remember what lies hidden in the corners of history, just as the shadow lay hidden in the corner of the picture. It has given us not a face, but a feeling, a reminder that no moment is ever truly gone as long as someone remembers them. So when the sun sinks low over Central Park, and the shadows grow long, and the laughter of children drifts into the air, it is not hard to imagine that somewhere just beyond sight, another child still stands, watching, a child not part of this time, but of another. A child whose presence is less about fear than about remembrance. A reminder of those who came before, those who played and laughed and vanished, but who are not entirely gone for as long as the story is told, as long as people pause to wonder the sexter. The Shadow Child remains. Perhaps that is the real strange secret of the photograph. That it was never about proving the existence of ghosts or catching something supernatural on film. It was about the way memory works, the way the heart refuses to let go. The photograph gave shape to the truth that children once filled that park and that some of them did not survive to see adulthood. It made visible what is usually invisible, the weight of history that lingers beneath the surface of daily life. That is why the story endures, because it speaks not only to the past, but to the present, to everyone who has ever loved and lost, to everyone who has ever felt the shadow of memory beside them. So the next time you walk through Central Park, pause a moment, look at the trees, look at the paths, look at the children running and laughing, and then look into the corners, into the shadows. Perhaps you will see nothing at all, or perhaps you will feel that faint sense of presence, that quiet reminder of lives once lived. Either way, you will know that you are not walking alone, for the park is filled with memory, and memory is the truest ghost of all. And if you happen to carry a camera with you, take a picture. You may capture nothing more than sunlight and laughter, or you may find when you look closer later that something else is there. Something quiet, something still, something watching, just as it was in the summer of 1898, when a forgotten photographer lifted his lens and caught not only a moment of joy, but also a shadow that would live on far longer than any of those children could have imagined him. That is how a simple photograph of children at play became a story passed down through generations, a story that carries both sorrow and beauty, a story that reminds us of the fragility of life and the power of memory. That is how Central Park in 1898 became not only a place of joy, but a place of haunting, a place where laughter and loss mingle in the same summer air. And that is how one shadow child hidden in the corner of a picture came to stand for all the unseen, all the forgotten, all the voices that still whisper beneath the leaves of Central Park.